Let me ask you something. When was the last time you were truly, completely, uncomfortably alone, and you didn't immediately reach for your phone? Think, when was it? Because here's what I've noticed. People will do anything to avoid being alone with themselves. They'll scroll for 4 hours through content they don't care about. They'll call someone they don't even like. They'll turn on a TV show just for background noise, not because they're watching it, but because the silence feels like something is wrong. And I want to ask you, why does silence feel like something is wrong? You've been told your whole life, by your school, by your culture, by every romantic movie ever made, that being alone means you failed at something. That solitude is the consolation prize for people who couldn't find their people. That if you're sitting by yourself at a restaurant, at a party, in your apartment on a Friday night, you are somehow less. That is one of the most destructive lies ever told to a human being. And today, we are going to dismantle it, piece by piece. Because what I'm about to show you, through history, through philosophy, through real stories, is this. The most dangerous, most powerful, most free version of a human being is the one who has learned to be completely comfortable alone. Not lonely, not isolated, not broken. Alone, deliberately, powerfully, on purpose. That is not weakness. That is the rarest strength on earth. And by the end of this, you're going to want to protect your solitude the way you protect your money, your time, your energy, because it is worth more than all of them combined. Stay with me. Let's talk about something no one talks about honestly. Society doesn't just prefer that you stay connected. It needs you to stay connected. It profits from your discomfort with being alone. Think about that for a second. Every app on your phone is engineered, not by accident, but by rooms full of the smartest psychologists and behavioral scientists in the world, to make sure that the moment you feel even a flicker of boredom or emptiness, you go there. You open that app, you scroll, you compare, you react, you consume. And the moment you consume, someone makes money. Your restlessness is someone else's revenue stream. There's a term in behavioral science called social validation feedback loop. It's the same mechanism that keeps a gambler at a slot machine. The variable reward, sometimes you get a like, sometimes you don't, creates an anxiety loop that is almost impossible to break without conscious effort. You are not addicted to your phone. You are addicted to the fear of being without approval. And here's where it gets really uncomfortable. That fear didn't start with smartphones. It started in childhood. When you raised your hand in class and waited, heart pounding, to see if the teacher would say, "Good answer." When you wore a certain thing to school to see if it would be accepted. When you changed the way you laughed, or spoke, or thought, to fit into a group that made you feel less alone. We were trained to need each other's approval for our sense of self. And a person who needs external approval to feel whole is a person who can be controlled. I don't say that to be harsh. I say it because understanding this is the beginning of your freedom. The Stoic philosophers, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, they lived in one of the most social, political, dangerous environments in human history, ancient Rome. A world where who you knew, who liked you, who feared you, all of it determined whether you lived or died. And yet, all three of them arrived at the same conclusion independently. The only freedom that cannot be taken from you is the freedom you find inside yourself, in silence, alone. Epictetus, who was literally born a slave, wrote that the man who is not master of himself is not free, regardless of his circumstances. He had nothing, no property, no legal rights, no status. But he had his mind, and he chose to cultivate that mind in solitude, in reflection, in disciplined thought, until he became one of the most influential thinkers in all of human history. He didn't need a crowd, he had himself, and that was enough. Here is something science and philosophy agree on, which doesn't happen often, so pay attention. Silence is not empty. In 2013, a study published in the journal Brain, Structure and Function found that 2 hours of silence per day could actually prompt cell development in the hippocampus, the part of your brain responsible for memory, learning, and emotional regulation. Not music, not meditation music, not lo-fi beats. Silence. Your brain, when given quiet, doesn't shut down. It activates what neurologists call the default mode network, the part of your brain that integrates experience, processes emotion, generates creative insight, and builds your sense of self. In other words, when you are quiet and alone, your brain is doing its most important work. But here's what's fascinating. The default mode network cannot fully activate when you're receiving external input. Every time you reach for your phone, check a notification, listen to someone else's voice, you are interrupting this process. You are literally stopping your brain from thinking your own thoughts. Think about that. When is the last time you had a thought that came entirely from you, not triggered by something you read or watched or heard from someone else? That is the hidden power of silence. It gives your mind back to you. Nikola Tesla, one of the most original thinkers in modern history, famously said that he could visualize his inventions so completely in his mind that he often didn't need to build a prototype. He designed entire electrical systems in his head, working in long solitary periods where he would speak to almost no one. He wasn't antisocial, he was protective of his mental space. He understood that his creative power required silence the way a fire requires oxygen. You don't have to be Tesla, but the principle is the same. Your best ideas, your most honest self-assessments, your most genuine desires, they live underneath all the noise. And silence is the only way to reach them. Let me tell you about a man who held more power than almost any human being in recorded history, and chose to spend his private hours completely alone with his thoughts. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of armies, head of the most powerful empire on earth. He had advisors, he had generals, he had a wife, children, a court full of people competing for his attention at every hour of every day, and every single morning, before the world could reach him, he sat alone. He wrote, not for anyone else, not for publication, not to be remembered or admired. He wrote for himself. What he wrote became what we now call meditations, arguably the most personal philosophical document ever found. And what's remarkable is what he wrote about. He didn't write about his enemies. He didn't write about his victories. He didn't write about politics or power or status. He wrote about his own weaknesses, his frustrations, his fears, his tendency to lose patience, his anxiety about death, his struggle to act rightly when no one was watching. He was the most powerful man alive, and he used his solitude to hold himself accountable. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." This wasn't performance. No one was meant to read this. This was a man, completely alone with himself, doing the work. And here is what I want you to understand about Marcus Aurelius. His greatness as an emperor was inseparable from his discipline in solitude. Every decision he made in public was shaped by the thinking he did in private. The Stoics had a practice called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Every morning you sit alone and visualize what could go wrong today, what difficulties might arise, how you might fail, how you might be tested. Not to be pessimistic, but to be prepared, so that when the chaos of the day arrived, and it always arrived, Marcus Aurelius was already at peace with it. He had already faced it in silence. That is the competitive advantage of solitude. The person who has sat with themselves, who knows their own mind, who has faced their own darkness in private, that person cannot be rattled by the world, because they've already survived themselves. Here's a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Who are you when no one is watching? Not who you want to be, not who you perform as, not the version of you that exists in the eyes of your colleagues, your followers, your family. Who are you at 2 a.m. when the room is dark and quiet and there's no one to impress? Most people are terrified of that question because they realize they don't know the answer. And the reason they don't know is because they've never been still long enough to find out. We build identities the way we build social media profiles, curated, strategic, audience-aware. We pick the things about ourselves we think people will approve of, and we amplify those. We hide the parts we're ashamed of. We adopt opinions because they make us belong to a group we want to be part of. Over time, this curated identity becomes the only one we know. We forget the raw, unfiltered self underneath. Solitude is the process of excavating that self. It's not comfortable. Think of it like archaeological digging. You go through layers, first the social personality, then the adopted beliefs, then the emotional wounds, then the childhood patterns. And at some point, if you go deep enough, you find something that isn't anyone else's. That is you. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard called this the single individual, the self that exists independent of the crowd, independent of history, independent of expectation. He believed that the greatest human task was to become that individual, and he was devastatingly clear that it could not be done in the company of others. It required solitude. It required the willingness to stand apart. The most common form of despair, Kierkegaard wrote, is not being who you are. Most people are in that despair. They just don't recognize it. They call it by other names: boredom, anxiety, restlessness, the vague feeling that something is missing. What's missing is themselves, and the path back is through the very silence they've been running from. Let's be completely honest about something. Approval is a drug. Neurologically, when someone validates you, a compliment, a like, a positive reaction, your brain releases dopamine, the same neurochemical pathway activated by sugar, gambling, and in extreme cases, cocaine. You are not choosing to crave approval. Your brain is chemically rewarding you for receiving it, which means breaking that cycle is not a matter of willpower alone. It's a matter of rewiring. And the only way to rewire it is through repeated, sustained experience of being okay without the approval. Here's what that looks like practically. You make a decision, a real one, a meaningful one, and you tell no one. You don't post about it. You don't ask for advice. You don't share it in a group chat for reactions. You make the decision based entirely on your own judgment, and you live with the outcome entirely on your own terms. That is terrifying for most people, because what if it's wrong? What if you fail? What if the decision you made without consulting anyone turns out to be a mistake? Here's the answer. Then you learn from yourself, by yourself. And the wisdom you gain from that cycle, decision, action, consequence, reflection, done entirely within your own inner world, without external interference, that wisdom belongs to you in a way that no advice ever will. You cannot outsource your own self-knowledge. Friedrich Nietzsche, controversial, brilliant, deeply misunderstood, wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." Owning yourself. That phrase should stop you. How much of you do you currently own? How many of your opinions came from you? How many of your goals are yours? How many of your fears were handed to you by someone else? Solitude is the audit. It's the process of looking at every belief, every habit, every identity claim, and asking, is this mine, or did I inherit it? What survives that audit is your actual self, and that self needs no external validation, because it was never built from it. The Stoics weren't monks. They weren't hermits. They didn't preach isolation. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. Seneca was a senator and playwright. Epictetus ran a philosophy school. They lived in the world, actively, fully, but they carried solitude with them inside, like a room within themselves that no external event could enter. Seneca called this the practice of recollectio, the gathering of yourself inward. he wrote to his friend Lucilius, "Retire into yourself as much as you can. Associate with those who are likely to make you better. Not withdraw from the world. Retire into yourself." The Stoics believed that most human suffering came not from circumstances, but from our judgments about circumstances. And judgments, wrong ones, reactive ones, fear-driven ones, are most likely when we are entirely shaped by external input. The person who has never sat with themselves has no internal reference point. They don't know what they actually think because they've never thought without influence. The Stoics called this episteme, clear knowing, and they were unambiguous. Clear knowing requires quiet. It requires the willingness to step back from the noise and examine life with your own eyes. Epictetus gave his students an exercise. He called it the observer self-practice. In any moment of difficulty or confusion, you pause, you step back mentally, and you ask, what is actually happening here, and what is my judgment about it, and are those the same thing? This practice only works in a mind that has been trained by solitude, a mind that has learned to be still, a mind that isn't constantly reacting to the loudest external input. The Stoic lesson on solitude is this: the strength you develop alone is the only strength that holds in every situation life throws at you. A reputation built on other people's opinions can collapse overnight. Status built on social connection disappears the moment the connection changes. Even physical strength fades. But the person who knows themselves, who has forged their values in solitude, who has tested their convictions in private before carrying them into public, that person has something no external force can take. I want to tell you a story, not of an emperor, not of a philosopher, of an ordinary person. In 2011, a young man named James, 23 years old, studying finance at a university in London, had what appeared to the outside world to be everything. He was popular. He was in the right friend group. He had a path laid out: finish degree, join a firm, climb the ladder. His parents were proud. His friends were doing the same thing. And he was miserable. Not in a way he could explain to anyone, not in a way that showed on the surface. He laughed at the right moments. He showed up to the parties. He nodded along in lectures. But inside, there was a quiet voice he kept ignoring. A voice that kept asking, "Is this your life or someone else's?" One summer, his plans fell apart. The internship he wanted didn't come through. His friend group scattered for the summer. His girlfriend ended the relationship. And for the first time in his adult life, James had weeks of genuine, unstructured, unavoidable solitude. At first, he filled it frantically. He'd never been good at being alone. He'd always needed noise, company, plans. But slowly, without anyone to perform for, without anyone's expectations pressing on him, something shifted. He started writing. Not for anyone. Just to hear what his own thoughts sounded like when they weren't shaped by the room he was in. He discovered over those weeks that he didn't actually want to work in finance, that he had wanted it because it was what serious, successful people did, and he had been building his identity around being a serious, successful person since he was 16 years old. But the actual James, the one under all of that, wanted to build things, physical things. He had always loved design, had always found himself staring at architecture, at product design, at the way objects were made. He changed his path. His parents were confused. Some friends thought he'd lost it. He didn't care, because for the first time the decision came from him. Today, James runs a small but internationally recognized product design studio. He employs 12 people. He says the best professional decision he ever made was forced on him by accident, by an unplanned summer alone with himself. The solitude didn't give him a new career. It gave him back himself. The career followed naturally. Let's go into the dark for a moment, because this is where most scripts and most conversations stop, and that's exactly why most people never break through. Loneliness, real loneliness, is painful. That's not philosophical. That's biological. Humans are social creatures. Isolation activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Researchers at the University of Michigan found that social rejection triggers the same brain region as a burn on your skin. So when I say embrace solitude, I am not dismissing that. I am making a crucial distinction that most people miss. Loneliness is the pain of feeling disconnected from others against your will. Solitude is the power of choosing to be with yourself. They feel similar on the surface. Both involve being alone, but they are psychologically completely different. Loneliness says, I'm alone and I don't want to be. Solitude says, I am alone and I am exactly where I need to be. The shift from one to the other is not about changing your circumstances, it's about changing your relationship with yourself. And this is the uncomfortable truth. Most people experience loneliness not because they lack others in their lives, but because they are not good company for themselves. They don't like what they find when they look inward. They don't like the thoughts. They don't trust their own judgment. They don't feel comfortable with who they are when the performance is off. So the fear of loneliness is actually the fear of self-confrontation. And that fear must be walked through, not around. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist, described what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we have rejected, suppressed, or refused to acknowledge, the jealousy we feel but won't admit, the ambitions we're ashamed of, the fears we perform confidence over, the grief we never processed. The shadow doesn't disappear because you refuse to look at it. It grows. It leaks into your behavior in ways you can't control. It drives decisions you can't explain. Solitude is the space where you meet your shadow, where you look it in the face and say, I see you. You are part of me. I am not afraid of you. That confrontation is not pleasant, but it is transformative. Because a person who has faced their own darkness cannot be easily frightened by the darkness in the world. And a person who has made peace with their own shadow stops projecting it onto others, stops seeing enemies where there are none, stops reacting from wounds they refuse to acknowledge. This is why strong people are often quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have already said everything that needed to be said, to themselves, in private. In 2018, a woman named Priya, a lifestyle content creator in her late 20s based in New York, had 380,000 followers on Instagram. By every external metric, she had built something real. Brand deals, speaking invitations, recognition in the street. And she was having a breakdown. She told her therapist that she couldn't remember the last time she had eaten a meal without thinking about whether it was postable. She couldn't walk into a space without instinctively calculating the lighting. She had started to feel, in her own words, like a character I invented, trapped inside a performance I can't stop. Her therapist gave her an unusual prescription: 30 days, no posting, no consuming, no creating for public consumption, just herself. The first week was, by her description, the most uncomfortable experience of her adult life. The withdrawal was physical. She felt anxiety, restlessness, a crawling compulsion to check, to create, to share. But she had committed, so she sat with it. By the third week, something started emerging. She was cooking again. Not for the image, but because she genuinely loved the smell of garlic in olive oil at 6 in the evening. She was reading long books without half attention to her phone. She was walking in her neighborhood and actually seeing it, the architecture, the faces, the light. She was rediscovering what she actually found beautiful, separate from what her audience rewarded. She came back to content creation, but different. She began posting in a way that felt honest rather than optimized. She lost about 60,000 followers. Her engagement rate tripled. But more importantly, she stopped waking up every morning to the immediate anxiety of whether last night's post had performed. She had found in 30 days of solitude the thing she had been trying to share with others all along: herself. The social media trap is not the phone. It's the replacement of your internal compass with an external one. The moment you start defining what's good, beautiful, meaningful, funny, or worth doing by what other people respond to, you have handed your soul over to the algorithm. Solitude gives it back. Let's get practical, because philosophy without application is just entertainment. How do you actually turn time alone into personal power? First, create structured solitude. Not passive loneliness, not lying on the couch doing nothing. Intentional, committed time with yourself. This could be a morning ritual, 45 minutes before anyone or anything else gets access to your mind. No phone, no music, no input, just you. Perhaps a journal, perhaps a walk, perhaps stillness. The Stoics had a morning practice. Before beginning the day, they would ask themselves 3 questions. What might challenge my values today? How will I respond with integrity? What am I grateful to be able to do? This is not passive reflection. It is active mental preparation, done alone, in silence, before the noise of the world begins. Second, use solitude for honest self-assessment. Not self-criticism, that's just a different form of social pressure turned inward. Honest examination. Where am I right now in my life? Is this direction genuinely mine or inherited? What am I avoiding? What am I pretending doesn't bother me? What would I do if I were certain no one would ever judge me for it? Write the answers down, not to share, not to perform, for you alone. Third, protect your solitude like a resource, because that's what it is. Most high-performing people throughout history have understood this. Charles Darwin walked alone for 2 hours every day, a path he called his thinking path. No interruptions allowed. Virginia Woolf wrote that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write. And that second part is not about writing, it's about thinking. You need space that belongs only to you. Not just physical space, mental space. Time that isn't allocated to responding, reacting, performing, producing for others. Guard it fiercely, because here is what happens when you do. Decisions get clearer. Anxiety decreases, not because life gets easier, but because you know yourself well enough to trust your own responses. Relationships improve, paradoxically, because you stop needing people to fill a void and start choosing people genuinely. You become less reactive and more intentional. That is personal power, not dominance over others, authorship over your own life. There is a progression that happens if you commit to this. It begins with discomfort. Every time you sit alone without reaching for stimulation, without seeking input or validation, there is a period of discomfort. The mind doesn't like it at first. It throws up anxious thoughts. It tells you you're missing out. It tells you something is wrong. This is withdrawal from approval dependency. It is real, it is temporary, and it is necessary. Then comes something quieter, a kind of settling. The noise in your head begins to organize itself. The panic subsides. Thoughts that were chaotic start to find their natural order. This is your mind beginning to trust itself. Then, and this is the moment that changes people, comes clarity. A knowing, not loud, not dramatic. A quiet, absolute certainty about who you are and what matters to you. I've spoken to many people who have been through deliberate periods of solitude. Monks, executives, athletes, artists. They all describe the same thing. Not enlightenment, not transcendence. A simple, unshakable sense of being enough. Not better than others, not special, not immune to difficulty. Just enough, exactly as they are, without needing anyone to confirm it. That is freedom, not freedom from responsibility or difficulty. Freedom from the exhausting performance of seeking approval. And with that freedom comes a different kind of engagement with the world. You stop performing connection and start experiencing it. You stop trying to be liked and start being real. You stop building a life that looks good to others and start building one that feels true to you. This is the transformation, and it begins every single time with the willingness to be alone. Every great figure in history who changed something, really changed it, went through a period of radical aloneness. Not as punishment, as preparation. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison. 27 years of enforced solitude, stripped of his freedom, his family, his public presence. And he emerged, not broken, not bitter, not diminished, but with a clarity, a moral authority, a groundedness that no comfortable life could have produced. He later wrote that the prison years, as horrific as they were, gave him something. They gave him himself, undistractable, unshakable, clear. He said, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear." That conquest happens in solitude. Aung San Suu Kyi spent 15 years under house arrest in Burma, alone. And she did not collapse into despair. She read, she meditated, she refined her political philosophy with the kind of depth that only comes from sustained, uninterrupted thinking. She told a journalist afterward that the years of isolation, though imposed, though unjust, gave her a kind of intellectual and spiritual clarity she could not have achieved any other way. Then look at Einstein, socially awkward, often described by contemporaries as emotionally distant. He worked in isolation for months on problems he refused to discuss with colleagues until he had exhausted his own thinking. Thought experiments, he called them. Mental journeys undertaken entirely alone, in silence, inside the laboratory of his own mind. The theory of special relativity emerged not from collaboration, but from a young man alone in a Swiss patent office, with time and silence, and an obstinate refusal to accept the conventional answer. The pattern is consistent across every field, every era, every culture. The people who leave a mark are the people who learned to stand alone, not because they rejected others, but because they had a core, a self, that was built in solitude and therefore could not be dissolved by circumstance. People talk about legacy, about impact, about leaving something behind that matters. But very few people ask the prior question, who is leaving it? A person built from external approval, whose identity is assembled from other people's opinions, whose values were handed down rather than examined. That person's legacy is, at best, the successful continuation of something someone else started. The ultimate gift of solitude is authorship, the ability to be the author of your own life, not a character in someone else's story, not a reflection of the crowd's expectations, the actual writer. And authorship requires knowing your own voice, your voice. Not the voice you put on for different audiences, not the polished version, not the version trained by years of seeking approval. Your actual deep, unperformed voice, the one that tells you what's beautiful and what isn't, the one that knows when something is wrong, even when everyone else says it's right, the one that gets quiet when a decision is right and loud when it isn't. That voice only speaks clearly in silence. There's a moment, if you go far enough into solitude, when you realize something that initially feels absurd, and then, the more you hold it, becomes the most obvious truth you've ever encountered. You were never incomplete. The longing you've been chasing, the approval you've been seeking, the belonging you've been searching for in rooms full of people who were themselves searching. None of it was filling a void. There was no void. There was only the unfamiliarity with your own self, making it feel like something was missing, when the missing thing, you, was there the whole time, waiting in the silence, waiting for you to get quiet enough to hear it. We have covered a great deal of ground today. We talked about the lie society told you, that being alone is a failure. We looked at how that lie serves systems that profit from your disconnection from yourself. We explored what silence actually does to your brain, what solitude actually does to your identity. We walked through Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire from a place of inner stillness. We met James, who found his real path only when the noise of his social world went quiet. We saw Priya step off a platform that had replaced her soul with a performance, and find herself again in 30 days of deliberate silence. We looked at how the Stoics turned solitude into philosophy that has survived 2,000 years. We understood the difference between loneliness, which is pain, and solitude, which is power. We examined what it means to face your own shadow, rather than project it onto the world. And we arrived here. The simple, profound, world-altering truth that you, as you are in silence alone, are more than enough. Not as a consolation, as a fact. The silence is not empty. It is the most full place you will ever enter. It holds your real thoughts, your real desires, your real voice, your real self, waiting patiently with extraordinary loyalty for you to stop running. The world will always be loud. There will always be another distraction, another opinion, another invitation to define yourself through someone else's eyes. But you now know something different. You know that the person who has sat with themselves, truly sat in honest, uncomfortable, beautiful silence, is a person who cannot be rattled, cannot be manipulated, cannot be hollowed out by disapproval or swelled hollow by praise, because they know who they are. And that knowing is the only power that has ever, in all of human history, produced anything worth leaving behind. So here is your invitation, not to isolate, not to reject the world, to go home to yourself, to sit in the silence, tonight, tomorrow morning, whenever you can carve out the space, and instead of filling it, listen. Listen to what has been waiting. You may not like everything you hear at first, but keep listening. Because underneath the fear, underneath the noise, underneath every version of yourself you've built for an audience, there is something honest and strong and entirely yours. And it has been waiting for you. The silence is not your enemy. It is where your power lives.